At approximately 4 a.m. on February 24th, the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, announced a special military operation for the alleged demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, thereby unleashing the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War.
Circumstances require us to take decisive and immediate action. You should know that Russia's response will be decisive and will lead you to such consequences that you have never experienced in your life. We are ready for any consequences.
In a few minutes, missile strikes began all over the territory of Ukraine. Russian troops invaded areas near Kharkiv, Kherson, Chernihiv, Sumy, entering from Russia, Belarus, and the temporarily annexed Crimea. Thanks to the strong resistance of the Ukrainian army and self-defense forces, the enemy army already suffered significant losses in manpower and technical equipment in the first days of the aggression. It led to logistical and technical problems for its troops, lack of fuel, ammunition and food, as well as undermining the morale of the invaders. According to the military balance report, on the eve of a full-scale invasion, Ukraine had 858 tanks, mostly based on Soviet T-64s. About 300 more could be held as reserve units in warehouses and factories. Such number of equipment was critically insufficient to deter the invasion. However, the courage of the Ukrainians and their heroism in the fight against the Russians impressed everyone. The almost instantaneous unification of the countries of the world to help Ukraine and the introduction of powerful sanctions against Russia were a blow below the belt for the aggressor country. Even before the open invasion in February, the American authorities arranged the supply of lethal weapons to Ukraine. After February 24th, the volume of military supplies increased significantly. Ukraine received dozens of types of weapons from the Allies. French Caesar artillery systems and Italian Milara Mod howitzers, American HIMARS multiple rocket launcher system that has already become legendary, and Czech RM-70 Vampire, heavy Finnish mortar 120 KRH-92, and Swedish anti-aircraft Bofors L-70, British frontline armored cabs, Spartan and German anti-aircraft tanks Gepard, as well as PWR river gunboats and Leopard 2 tanks. Moreover, Ukrainian air defense has been strengthened by Patriot, Iris-T and NASAMS anti-aircraft missile systems. Overseas partners give Ukraine not only weapons and machinery, but also funds for the purchase of their military equipment.
Every day Ukrainians pay with their lives and they fight along the atrocities that the Russians are engaging in are just beyond the pale. And the cost of the fight is not cheap, but caving to aggression is even more costly. That's why we're staying in this. Yesterday we celebrated VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, marking the end of a transition of the devastation as a consequence of World War II.
On May 9, 2022, a symbolic date for the Russian world, a historic event took place. Joe Biden signed the Lend-Lease Act for Ukraine. Now it can become an important factor in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. What do the Lend-Lease Acts of 1941 and 2022 have in common? First of all, Russia's efforts to distort the facts. The Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council has to debunk Russian fakes about Lend-Lease for Ukraine. The Lend-Lease bill was registered back in January. It means that in Washington they were perfectly aware of the rapid approach of the war and fully prepared for it. The senators introduced the bill on the supply of arms to Ukraine under Lend-Lease at the beginning of January. However, the collection of senators' signatures, which began on January 19, 2022, ended only on March 24th. Only afterwards was it transferred to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. At the same time, the submission of the bill to the Senate did not guarantee its passage. Many future generations of Ukrainians will pay for the weapons that the US will supply to Ukraine on Lend-Lease terms. Debts can arise only if Ukraine wants to keep the military equipment obtained through Lend-Lease after the war with Russia. At the same time, all weapons destroyed and lost during hostilities are written off. However, there is nothing out of the ordinary in this behavior of the Russian authorities. Even after the Second World War, Soviet propaganda began to create myth around the topic of Lend-Lease. that the USSR allegedly won the war single-handedly, that the Allies were handing over outdated and low-quality equipment, weapons and materials, that their help did not play a significant role in the victory over Germany. So what exactly was Lend-Lease during World War II? And why does the Soviet Union and now Russia try not to publicly mention the comprehensive aid of 1941? From equipping entire factories to fabric and buttons for generals' greatcoats.
Ленд-ліз, як відомо, це система
Lend-Lease, as you know, is a system of US military assistance to countries whose security was important to the United States of America. This point became the main thesis of the law adopted on March 11, 1941. It can be said that it was one of the key factors in the victory of the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition over Germany and its accomplices in World War II.
над Німеччиною та її союзникам у роки Другої світової війни.
Lend-Lease, translated from English, denotes an action of lending, granting something on lease. Lend-Lease provisions stipulated that after the war, the surviving machinery and equipment must be returned to the United States. After Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, US President Franklin Roosevelt immediately offered help to the USSR. The first supplies of weapons and equipment began in October 1941.
There were negotiations, there was a series of meetings between representatives of the USA, Great Britain and the Soviet Union, where, of course, the Soviet Union took the following stance: we need more and more supplies. When this aid actually began, it was stipulated that the United States would supply the Soviet Union with approximately 400 aircraft and 500 tanks per month. From this, we conclude that it was only about the essential things, as by 1941, a huge amount of equipment of the Soviet Union had already been destroyed. It is known that in the first few months of the war, the Soviet Union lost almost all of its aviation, and there is even a proven thesis that on the 100th day of the war, September 29, 1941, the USSR was left without 96% of its combat aircraft.
It is a proven fact that without help, the Soviet Union would not have been able to resume aircraft production at all, since the powerful aluminium plant in Zaporizhia remained on the territory occupied by the Germans.
As of the summer of 1942, the entire territory of Ukraine was already occupied. It is no secret that the center and east of Ukraine were an important industrial sector of the Soviet Union. This was especially true because of aluminum.
With the loss of Ukraine, the Soviet Union also felt an urgent need for provisions. Those supplies that could not be taken away were destroyed by the Soviet units, which were retreating and obeying Stalin's order to leave nothing to the enemy. The threat of starvation was becoming real.
When the
German attack on the Soviet Union occurred, Ukraine was the breadbasket of both the Soviet Union and Europe, despite the industrialization processes that had taken place before. And it is clear that the loss of this territory in the end made the Soviet Union face the problem of food shortage. Huge aid from the US was directed at closing this food issue.
Закрити це продовольче питання.
From 1941 to 1945, the American food industry did deliver under the Lend-Lease program, even though it's hard to believe it, 2 billion cans. The fighters, the frontline soldiers, even joked, calling the American stew the second front. Food, not only stew, but also many other products, came not only to the front line to feed the soldiers, but were also a significant supporting element in the diet of the rearguards.
It is also worth mentioning Willys ORVs and Studebaker trucks, on the platforms of which the famous Katyusha multiple rocket launcher systems were created. Lend-Lease assistance with aircraft supplies was also significant. During the entire war, the Soviet troops received more than 14,000 aircraft from the United States of America and Great Britain. This is 13% of the entire Soviet aircraft fleet. Lend-Lease provided for the needs of the Soviet Union in means of communication and significantly in railway transport. 620,000 tons of rails, About 2,000 steam locomotives and more than 11,000 freight cars arrived in the USSR.
Головний і найбільш небезпечний
The main road, and the most dangerous one, is the supply across the Atlantic Ocean to Great Britain. And then the transport vessels, under the protection of military convoys, both Soviet and those of the Allies, headed for the northern ports of Murmansk, Polarny, etc. The road was the shortest one, but also the most dangerous.
але найбільш небезпечний.
During the entire war, 78 Arctic convoys were carried out. They were being constantly attacked by German aircraft and submarines. During these attacks, Great Britain lost 85 merchant ships and 16 warships. The most tragic one was convoy PQ-17 in 1942, during which only 13 ships out of 36 survived.
Коли закінчилося
When the liberation of Crimea and the southern part of the territory of Ukraine from Nazism was completed, the Black Sea through the Mediterranean also became the small bridge where came the support for the industry and the army of the Soviet Union.
Радянського Союзу.
Military personnel from various countries and of various nationalities, including Ukrainians, participated in the Lend-Lease aid delivery operation.
Матеріали учасників живих свідків і
The materials of living witnesses, Ukrainians by origin, are on display in the main exposition of the Museum of the History of Ukraine in the Second World War. Among them are the materials of Viktor Lyashenko, who was one of the authorized members of the Legislative Commission at the main maritime administration of the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union. It was he who laid out and built the ice channels in the Arctic ports. Another Ukrainian who is worth mentioning was Andriy Golovko, commander of the Northern Fleet of the Soviet Union. All these operations were carried out with his knowledge and under his direct supervision, as it was the Northern Fleet, together with surface boats and submarines, that undertook the organization of defense and protection of transport convoys.
охорони транспортних конвоїв.
Marshal Zhukov, a direct participant in those events and one of the commanders-in-chief of the Soviet army, wrote,
People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. We received 350,000 vehicles, but how great those machines were! We had neither explosives nor gunpowder. There was nothing to charge rifle cartridges with. The Americans really saved us with gunpowder and explosives, and how much steel they gave us. Could we really have set up the production of our tanks without American steel? And now they are saying that we had plenty of everything on our own.
The underestimation of the importance of the supply of military equipment, weapons and ammunition, medicine and food by the Allies was a result of the ideological foundations of the USSR. It was done in order to confirm the assumption that the Soviet military economy allegedly had a huge advantage over the economy of capitalist countries. However, in American historiography, the role of Lend-Lease supplies has always been rightly presented as a decisive factor in the ability of the USSR to wage war against Germany. The truce turned out to be uncomfortable for the Soviet Union and now for the Russian Federation. However, the Lend-Lease law for Ukraine, signed by US President Joe Biden in 2022, became even more uncomfortable for Russia. Now the mechanism, which has never been launched for any of the countries in the world since 1941, will begin to gain momentum. This act by the United States cannot be overstated. Ukraine will receive as much aid as it needs for the victory, because the defeat by the Russian Federation is a threat to the entire civilized world.
I am grateful to the United States, President Biden and Congress for an analog of the famous Lend-Lease program, which will be very helpful in the fight against Russia, against the Russian invaders, which helped a lot in the fight against the Nazis during World War II. I am sure that now the Lend-Lease will help Ukraine and the whole free world beat the ideological successors of the Nazis, who started a war against us on our land. Lend-Lease and other programs in support of Ukraine are concrete proof that freedom is still able to defend itself against tyranny.
Throughout the winter and early spring of 2023, mass media and military experts were discussing first the Russian offensive in Donbass and then the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive. If earlier representatives of American intelligence assumed that it would end in moderate success for Ukraine, now much more optimistic predictions are being made. According to British Secretary of State for Defense Ben Wallace, the deoccupation of Crimea is quite real already this year, as the Russians are running out of the necessary equipment. Along with Ukraine, the whole world is preparing for the liberation of the territories. While Lend-Lease is not working yet, the United States and Europe are working hard to supply weapons and improve the army. After all, not only the existence of Ukraine within its borders, but also the political landscape in the world depends on the success of military operations.
Today, America and our allies and partners are helping meet Ukraine's needs on the current battlefield while developing a force that can deter and defend against aggression for years to come. That means helping build a Ukrainian military of the future with long-term funding, a strong air force centered on modern combat aircraft.
The Ukrainian army proved its ability to defend the country, and after February 24th it began to apply Western practices and master new weapons on the battlefield. The armed forces of Ukraine has the highest level of trust among the institutions in the country. The British magazine The Economist named Ukraine Country of the Year in 2022 for the heroism of its people and resistance to the occupiers. And indeed, despite the loss of homes and peaceful sleep, the indomitable spirit and thirst for life of Ukrainians only strengthened. Despite everything, we are still full of optimism and confident in our victory.